The champagne glass shattered against marble before anyone understood what they were witnessing. Soren Vale stood in the doorway of the Crestwick ballroom, one hand pressed against his swollen belly, the other clutching a manila folder so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The violin music didn't stop, the servers didn't pause, but every eye in that room turned toward him like he'd walked in covered in blood. He wasn't supposed to be here. Rhett Marcelli felt the shift before he saw it, that primal alpha instinct that crawled up his spine when something threatened what belonged to him. His head snapped toward the entrance and the world tilted sideways. 3 years. 3 years of searching, threatening, bleeding the city dry for answers. 3 years of believing Soren was dead or worse. And now he was here, pregnant, shaking, alive. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Dahlia Crestwick's laugh cut through the silence like a knife scraping bone. She stood beside Rhett in a champagne-colored gown that cost more than most people's cars, her engagement ring catching the chandelier light as she leaned into her friends. Oh my God, he actually came. The women around her giggled behind their hands, phone cameras lifted, flashes sparked across the room like tiny explosions. Soren flinched with each burst of light, his shoulders curling inward, protective. The baby must have kicked because his free hand moved to cradle the bottom of his stomach, his face going pale. Rhett's scent changed so fast it made the nearest alphas step back. Sharp, dangerous, the kind of smell that meant someone was about to bleed. Rhett, Dahlia's voice dripped honey, but her eyes were cold. I wanted to surprise you. Isn't this fun, your little project? Decided to join us for our special night. Soren's eyes locked on Rhett's across 50 feet of polished floor and designer suits. There was no anger in them, no drama, just exhaustion so deep it looked like he'd been carrying it in his bones for years. And something else, something that made Rhett's chest crack open. Fear. Dahlia stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor like a countdown. Everyone look, Rhett's mute mistake decided to attend, and pregnant too, how tragic. She tilted her head, her smile perfect and poisonous. Tell us, sweetheart, who's the father, or did you forget his name? Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make Soren's hands tremble harder. Enough to make Rhett's jaw clench so tight it could crack teeth. Soren lifted his notepad with shaking fingers. He wrote slowly, carefully, like each letter cost him something. Then he held it up toward Rhett. The words were simple, clear, devastating. I didn't leave you, I was taken. The room stopped breathing. Rhett's vision tunneled. Every sound became underwater distant. He could see Dahlia's mouth moving, still laughing, still performing for the cameras. He could see her mother in the corner, smirking behind her champagne. He could see the old guard men shifting their weight, hands moving toward jacket pockets where weapons lived. But all he could really see was Soren, standing there with evidence in his hands and their child in his belly, and 3 years of hell written across his face. Dahlia blinked, her smile faltering for half a second. Oh please, how dramatic. She reached for the folder, her manicured nails flashing. What is this, some kind of... Soren stepped back, not fast, just enough, and opened the folder. The first document that slipped out had a letterhead everyone in that room recognized. CISTWSK Foundation. Rhett's eyes snapped to it, then to Dahlia, then back to the paper now visible in Soren's hands, names, dates, locations, all printed in clinical black ink, official seals, hospital stamps, shipping manifests. Dahlia's face drained of color, so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. Rhett, her voice cracked, not the smooth, controlled tone she'd used all night, something raw, panicked. Rhett, I don't know what he's trying to. But Rhett was already moving, not toward her, toward Soren. His soldiers shifted in perfect synchronization, a wall of black suits closing off the exits without a single word spoken. The guests noticed. Some tried to edge toward the doors. They found them blocked. Soren pulled out another page, then another, photos this time. Grainy security footage printed on standard paper but clear enough. Omegas with vacant eyes, hospital gurneys, loading docks, and in the corner of one image, partially visible but unmistakable, Dahlia's profile, talking to a man in scrubs. Someone in the crowd gasped. Dahlia lunged forward, heels skidding. Give me that. Rhett's hand shot out and caught her wrist. Not hard, but absolute. His voice came out quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. Don't move. And suddenly the joke wasn't funny anymore. Will Dahlia's empire crumble tonight, or does she have one final card to play? Rhett had learned sign language in 3 weeks. Not because he was naturally gifted. His hands were too used to holding guns and signing death warrants. But because every night Soren worked, Rhett showed up at that hospital with flashcards and bruised knuckles, and a desperation that didn't fit a man who owned half of Chicago's underworld. The first time Soren smiled at him, really smiled, Rhett felt something in his chest he thought he'd killed years ago. Hope. Dangerous, stupid, beautiful hope. It started small. Coffee at 3 a.m. in the empty cafeteria, Soren's notepad between them covered in sketches and half-finished thoughts. Rhett would talk about anything except his business, and Soren would listen with eyes that didn't judge, didn't flinch, didn't demand explanations. When Soren wrote back, his handwriting was careful, thoughtful, like he weighed every word before committing it to paper. "Why do you keep coming back?" Soren had written one night, 3 months into whatever they were becoming. Rhett had looked at him for a long time, long enough that Soren's shoulders tensed, preparing for rejection or worse. Then Rhett signed his answer, slow and deliberate, making sure every gesture was clear. "Because you make me want to be better." Soren's eyes had filled with tears he didn't let fall. He wrote quickly, almost frantically. "I'm not worth changing for." Rhett had taken the pen from Soren's hand and written, underneath in his own messy scrawl, "Let me decide that." That was the night everything shifted, when Rhett stopped pretending this was just curiosity or boredom or some alpha instinct to protect. When Soren stopped pretending, he didn't wait for Rhett's visits like they were the only hours in his week that mattered. They never labeled it, never made promises that could be broken, but Rhett kept every note Soren gave him in a locked drawer in his office, organized by date like sacred texts. And Soren started leaving the hospital's back entrance unlocked on nights he knew Rhett would come, a tiny act of trust that meant more than any vow. Rhett learned Soren drank his coffee with too much sugar and not enough cream, that he had a scar on his left shoulder from a childhood accident he never explained, that when he laughed, really laughed, silent and breathless, his whole face transformed into something that made Rhett want to burn down anything that had ever hurt him. The underworld noticed, of course they noticed. Rhett Marcelli didn't smile, didn't soften, didn't show up to territory meetings looking distracted. His captains whispered, his enemies watched, and his father's old allies, the ones who still believed power came from bloodlines and arranged marriages, they started making plans. Rhett didn't care. For the first time in his violent, calculated life, he didn't care about strategy or appearances or what his empire thought. He cared about the way Soren's hand felt in his when they walked through the empty hospital corridors at dawn. He cared about learning every silent language Soren spoke, the tilt of his head when he was tired, the way his fingers tapped when he was anxious, the small smile that meant "I feel safe with you." He was going to make it official, public, permanent, damn the consequences. He'd already bought the ring, a simple band, nothing flashy, because Soren didn't need diamonds to prove he was worth everything. He'd planned the moment, the rooftop garden of Soren's apartment building where they'd first kissed, overlooking the city Rhett ruled but would have abandoned in a heartbeat if Soren asked. He never got the chance. One night Soren didn't show up for work. Not unusual, he'd called in sick before, written that he needed a day to rest. But something felt wrong. Rhett called the hospital. They said Soren had quit. No notice, no forwarding information, just gone. Rhett went to his apartment. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was untouched except for one thing, Soren's notepad collection, years of thoughts and sketches and private words, all neatly stacked on the kitchen counter. On top, a single page torn carefully from the spiral binding. "Please don't look for me, they'll punish you." The handwriting was Soren's, but it shook in places Soren's writing never shook, like someone had held his hand steady while he wrote, like someone had made sure the message was clear. Rhett's rage that night became legend in Chicago's underworld. He'd torn through the city like a storm with a pulse, pulling every favor, threatening every contact, offering rewards that could retire families for generations. He found nothing. No body, no witnesses, no ransom, just silence where Soren used to be. The only clue came from a dock worker who swore he'd seen a medical transport van at the pier 3 nights before Soren vanished. The logo on the side was too blurred in his memory to identify, but he remembered the color. Crestwick Foundation blue. Rhett had filed that detail away, buried it under grief and fury because he had no proof, no leverage, no way to move against a family that powerful without evidence. And then Dahlia had appeared at his father's funeral 6 months later, offering condolences and political alliances, and a marriage proposal wrapped in silk and strategy. Rhett had said yes, not because he wanted her, but because he'd made a vow the night he lost Soren. No Omega would ever vanish from his city again. And if marrying into the Crestwick dynasty gave him access to their networks, their secrets, their dirty medical boards and shipping routes, then he'd play that game until he found the truth. He'd been playing for 3 years. And now Soren was standing 50 feet away, with a folder full of proof, and a baby that made the timeline snap into focus with brutal clarity. But that wasn't the worst part. What happened to Soren in those 3 years, and why is he risking everything to return now? Dahlia Crestwick learned early that beauty was currency, and cruelty was investment. Her mother taught her how to smile while calculating someone's weaknesses, how to dress like art and think like war, how to make powerful men believe they'd chosen her when really, she'd been hunting them all along. By 16, Dahlia could walk into a room and identify every person's pressure point within 5 minutes. By 20, she turned those pressure points into leverage. She didn't want Rhett because she loved him. Love was for people who couldn't afford better strategies. She wanted him because he was the king, and she'd spent her entire life preparing to be queen. The Marcelli Empire was the last piece of Chicago her family didn't control through money or politics or medical boards that decided which Omegas got rehabilitation and which ones disappeared into shipping containers. When she first heard about Soren, she'd laughed. A mute janitor, how quaint, how utterly unthreatening. Alphas had their little diversions, everyone knew that. They'd play house with pretty Omegas until reality reminded them that power didn't come from feelings. Rhett would get bored. He'd realize that marrying into the Crestwick dynasty meant access to senators, judges, international trade routes. Except he didn't get bored. Months passed and Rhett kept disappearing to that hospital like it was a shrine. His captains reported that he smiled now, actually smiled, not the cold stretch of lips he used in negotiations. He'd started refusing late-night meetings, claiming he had personal business. The old guard grew restless. Dahlia's father made calls. Her mother hosted dinners where eligible alpha daughters paraded their pedigrees like resumes. Rhett ignored them all. That's when Dahlia stopped laughing and started paying attention. She had her people follow him. Watched the security footage of him entering the hospital's service entrance at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Saw him sitting in a cafeteria with someone whose face the cameras couldn't quite capture, learning sign language from online videos on his phone like a lovesick teenager. She'd expected anger when she found out. Instead, she felt something worse. Fear. Because she recognized the look on Rhett's face in those grainy videos. The way he leaned in when Soren wrote something. The way his shoulders relaxed in a way they never did during business. The way he touched Soren's hand like it was made of something holy. Rhett looked at Soren, the way Dahlia had spent years trying to make men look at her. And no amount of beauty or strategy or carefully calculated charm could compete with whatever that was. So she'd done what she always did when threatened. She called her father. Marcus Crestwick didn't ask questions about morality. He asked questions about cost-benefit analysis. And when Dahlia explained that a mute Omega janitor was derailing a multi-billion-dollar alliance, he'd made a phone call, then another, then a meeting with the medical board director who owed the family favors for malpractice cover-ups. 3 weeks later, Soren Vale disappeared from the city like he'd never existed. Dahlia had expected relief. Instead, she got a front-row seat to watching Rhett Marcelli become something terrifying. He'd searched with the kind of focus that burned cities, offered rewards that bankrupted smaller families, threatened people who'd never been threatened before. For 6 months, the city held its breath waiting for war. And then Rhett's father died, and Dahlia made her move. She showed up at the funeral in black silk and tears she'd practiced in the mirror, offered condolences, mentioned how her family had always respected his father's vision, suggested that perhaps this tragedy could become an opportunity, a merger of empires, a union of power. Rhett had looked at her with eyes that held no light and said one word, "Fine." The engagement was announced within a month. The media called it a power couple. The old guard approved. Dahlia's mother bought champagne, and Dahlia herself felt nothing but cold satisfaction because she'd won. The mute Omega was gone, and the crown was hers. Except winning felt hollow when Rhett looked through her like she was glass, when he never touched her except for photographs, when he kept that locked drawer in his office that she knew, held every scrap of paper Soren had ever written on. She'd tried to be patient, tried to prove herself indispensable, connecting Rhett with politicians, smoothing over territorial disputes with charm her family specialized in, but Rhett remained distant, cold, functional. He treated their engagement like a business contract, which technically it was, but Dahlia had expected more, wanted more, deserved more. That's when the idea came to her. A gala, public, glamorous, the kind of event that cemented legacies. She'd announce their wedding date, showcase their empire to the city's elite, prove once and for all that she and Rhett were inevitable. And just for fun, just to finally kill that ghost that haunted her, she'd invite Soren. Watching him shuffle in, broken and desperate and clearly beneath everyone in that room, would be the perfect reminder of why Rhett had chosen power over sentimentality. She'd instructed her assistant personally, find the mute janitor, Soren Vale, tell him it's a formal invitation to Rhett Marcelli's engagement celebration, make it sound special. Her assistant had hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm not sure we should." "Do it," Dahlia had said, her smile sharp. "I want everyone to see what Rhett used to love." She'd imagined Soren arriving small, quiet, forgettable. Maybe he'd cry, maybe he'd leave immediately. Either way, it would be closure, proof that Dahlia had won not just the battle, but the war. She never imagined he'd walk in pregnant. She definitely never imagined he'd walk in with evidence. And she absolutely never imagined that her perfect, carefully orchestrated humiliation would become the night her entire family's empire started collapsing. But that's exactly what was happening now, as Soren stood in her ballroom holding documents that shouldn't exist, wearing evidence that couldn't be denied, and looking at Rhett like he was the only person in the room worth saving. And now everyone had heard her confession without audio. How deep does the Crestwick family's corruption run, and who else is about to fall? The first week Soren disappeared, Rhett convinced himself it was a mistake. People didn't just vanish in his city, not without bodies or witnesses or some kind of trace. He owned enough cops and politicians to access every camera feed in Chicago. He had informants in hospitals, shelters, bus stations. Someone always saw something, someone always talked. But not this time. Rhett started at the hospital where Soren worked. The administration claimed he'd quit via email, no phone call. No in-person notice, just a 2-sentence resignation sent at 4 a.m. Rhett demanded to see the email. The timestamp checked out. The phrasing was formal, distant, nothing like how Soren wrote in his notepads. But the account was Soren's, the password had been entered correctly, and there was no evidence of hacking. Maybe he just needed a fresh start. The HR director had suggested nervously, very aware that Rhett Marcelli was asking questions in a tone that meant people's lives were on the line. Rhett had left without another word, and burned through every contact he had. He pulled security footage from a 3-block radius around Soren's apartment, watched 48 hours of grainy video in fast forward, looking for any sign of movement, found nothing except a medical transport van that had parked outside Soren's building at 2 a.m, idling for 12 minutes before driving away. No logo visible in the footage, no license plate clear enough to trace. He sent men to every homeless shelter, every Omega refuge, every underground clinic, offered money first, then threats. No one had seen Soren, no one had heard his name. It was like the city had swallowed him whole and left no bones behind. The dock worker sighting came on day 9. An older man who loaded shipping containers at the pier called one of Rhett's captains, said he'd seen something weird the week before. A medical van, the kind used for patient transport, backed up to a container labeled for international shipping. The side door had been opened just long enough for him to see someone inside. Someone small, slumped over, not moving. Could have been medical equipment, the worker had said, nervous, but it looked like a person, and the van had a logo I've seen before, blue and white, something Foundation, fancy looking. Rhett had driven to the pier himself at 3 a.m. and stood in the spot the worker described. Salt air, crane shadows, shipping containers stacked like building blocks waiting to be shipped to ports Rhett knew were owned by families that traded in more than legal goods. He'd made calls, pulled shipping manifests, found 3 containers sent to unmarked locations in Eastern Europe that week, all with medical equipment listed as cargo, all approved by a board of directors that included 2 Crestwick family members. But there was no proof, no names, no evidence that would hold up against a family that could buy judges and silence witnesses. Just suspicion and rage and a growing certainty that Soren hadn't left, he'd been taken. Rhett had wanted to go to war that night, wanted to drag every Crestwick into the street and demand answers until someone broke. But his captains talked him down, reminded him that moving against a family that powerful without concrete evidence would start a conflict that would bleed the city dry. So Rhett made a different choice, a slower, more calculated one. He started tracking the Crestwick Empire the way a hunter tracks prey, learning their patterns, their weak points, their secrets. He traced their shipping routes, their medical board connections, their off-books clinics that offered rehabilitation services for Omegas whose families didn't ask too many questions. He found patterns, gaps in records where patients checked in but never checked out, transport vans that made late-night runs to the pier, shipping manifests with medical equipment listed as cargo but weight discrepancies that suggested human passengers. It was an Omega trafficking ring, organized, profitable, protected by enough legal cover that proving it would take years of investigation. And the Crestwick family was at the center of it, using their medical foundation as a front, their shipping company as transport, their political connections as shields. Rhett had started building his case quietly, collecting evidence, bribing officials to turn informant, preparing for the day he'd have enough proof to bury them all. And then Dahlia had shown up at his father's funeral with condolences and a marriage proposal, and Rhett had seen an opportunity. Get close to the family, access their networks from the inside, find out what happened to Soren and every other Omega who disappeared into their system. So he'd said yes to the engagement, played the role of grieving alpha looking for stability, let Dahlia think she'd won, and spent 3 years gathering evidence while lying next to the enemy and thinking about Soren every single night. He never stopped searching, never stopped hopping, even when logic said Soren was dead or too broken to come back, even when his captains suggested moving on, finding closure, accepting reality. Because Rhett knew something no one else seemed to understand. Soren Vale wasn't weak. He was quiet, yes. He was gentle, yes. But underneath that silence was steel that didn't break, only bent. And if Soren was still alive somewhere, still breathing, still fighting, then Rhett would find him. He just never expected Soren to find him first. Standing in that ballroom, watching Soren hold evidence that matched everything Rhett had been building for 3 years, feeling the weight of the baby between them that couldn't be denied, Rhett realized something that made his blood run cold. Soren hadn't just survived, he'd escaped, he'd kept evidence, he'd protected their child, and he'd walked back into hell voluntarily because he knew Rhett needed proof to act. That kind of courage didn't come from weakness. It came from love. And suddenly, the city wasn't the only thing about to burn. What did Soren endure in those 3 years, and how did he escape with evidence that could destroy an empire? The ballroom had transformed from celebration to crime scene without a single gunshot fired. Rhett stood at the center of it, still holding the first page Soren had pulled from that folder, his eyes scanning names and dates and locations that matched his own investigation so perfectly it felt like looking at a mirror. 3 years of quiet work, 3 years of bribes and threats and careful documentation. And Soren had walked in with the missing pieces, hospital records, shipping manifests, photographs with timestamps and faces that would hold up in court. Dahlia tried to laugh again, tried to reclaim control. Rhett, this is absurd. Whatever he's showing you is clearly. Shut up, Rhett didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The command in those 2 words made Dahlia's mouth snap closed like she'd been slapped. Several guests gasped. Dahlia Crestwick didn't get talked to like that, not in public, not by anyone. But Rhett wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Soren, who'd gone even paler, swaying slightly on his feet. The baby was moving. Rhett could see it even from 15 feet away, the visible shift of Soren's belly beneath his coat. How far along was he? 7 months, 8, and he'd walked into this room knowing exactly what Dahlia had planned, knowing he'd be mocked and humiliated, but came anyway because the evidence mattered more than his safety. That's when Rhett felt something crack open in his chest. Not the careful, controlled version of himself he'd maintained for 3 years, the real him, the alpha who'd burned through Chicago looking for answers, the man who'd kept every note Soren had ever written like they were religious texts. He moved towards Soren in 3 long strides. The crowd parted automatically, instinct telling them to get out of the way when an alpha moved like that, focused, dangerous, protective. Dahlia reached for his arm. He shook her off without looking. Soren's eyes went wide as Rhett approached, his hands clutching the folder tighter, like he expected Rhett to take it and tell him to leave. Like he still didn't understand that nothing, not politics, not power, not 3 years of hell, had changed what Rhett felt. Rhett stopped 2 feet away, close enough to see the exhaustion in Soren's face, close enough to smell the stress-free exhaustion coming off him in waves, close enough to see his hands shaking. How long? Rhett signed, his hands moving in the language he'd learned and never forgotten. Soren blinked, tears started forming but didn't fall. His own hands moved slowly, rusty from years of disuse. 8 months. The math hit Rhett like a bullet. 8 months pregnant, 3 years missing, which meant Soren had been carrying their child for the last year he'd been held captive, probably drugged, definitely abused, and somehow still managed to escape with evidence intact. Rhett's scent shifted again. Every alpha in the room felt it, that primal rage that came right before violence. The old guard soldiers tensed. Hands moved toward weapons. The civilian guests started backing toward the doors, only to find Rhett's men already blocking them with crossed arms and expressions that said nobody was leaving until this was finished. Dahlia's mother stood up from her table, champagne glass still in hand, her voice cutting through the tension with that same polished authority she used on hospital boards. "This is ridiculous. Rhett, you're making a scene over forged documents and an Omega who clearly—" "Mrs. Crestwick," Rhett finally turned to face her, "I'd suggest you call your lawyer, you're going to need several." The woman's face froze mid-smile. "Excuse me." Rhett pulled out his phone, didn't unlock it, just held it up so everyone could see the screen, a single contact name pulled up, ready to dial. "I have the FBI on speed dial. They've been waiting 3 years for me to give them probable cause to investigate your family's medical foundation. I think they'll be very interested in what's in this folder." Panic flashed across several faces in the crowd. Not everyone, but enough. The ones who knew, the ones who'd benefited, the ones who'd looked the other way while Omegas disappeared into shipping containers labeled medical equipment. Dahlia lunged forward, heels clicking fast against marble. "You can't do this. My family has connections. We have." Had Rhett corrected, his voice still eerily calm, past tense, "Because the second I make this call, every agency that's been waiting for an excuse to investigate the Crestwick Empire gets a green light. And I'm guessing once they start digging, they're going to find a lot more than one missing Omega." He looked directly at Dahlia, and for the first time since their engagement, let her see the truth in his eyes, the hatred, the disgust, the barely contained rage that had been building for 3 years. "You invited him here as a joke," Rhett said. "You wanted to humiliate him in front of everyone. You wanted me to see him broken so I'd finally stop looking for him." His jaw clenched. "But you made one mistake." "What mistake?" Dahlia's voice cracked. Not the smooth, controlled tone anymore, something raw, desperate. Rhett stepped back toward Soren, didn't touch him yet, just stood close enough that his presence was a shield between Soren and everyone else in that room. "You assumed he was weak because he was silent. You assumed he'd break because you'd broken others. You assumed love made me soft." He pulled out another document from the folder Soren still held, a photograph this time, printed in color, showed a concrete room, medical equipment, restraints on a bed, and in the corner, partially visible but unmistakable, the Crestwick Foundation logo on the wall. "This is where you kept him," Rhett said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Where you drugged him, where you held him for 3 years while I tore this city apart looking for answers." He held up the photo so the cameras could see, so the guests could see, so everyone would have evidence they'd been witnesses to this moment. "And you know what the real joke is, Dahlia?" She didn't answer, couldn't. Her face had gone sheet white, her perfect composure finally cracking. Rhett's smile was cold, sharp, the kind of expression that made his reputation. "I've been building a case against your family for 3 years, every shipping manifest, every suspicious death, every Omega who disappeared through your foundation's doors. I have it all documented, verified, ready to hand over." He gestured to Soren, and he just walked in with the proof I needed to make it stick. The ballroom erupted, guests shouting questions, Dahlia's family members rushing toward the exits only to be stopped by Rhett's soldiers, phone cameras flashing. Someone knocked over a champagne tower and glass shattered across marble. Through it all, Soren stood perfectly still, one hand on his belly, watching Rhett like he still couldn't quite believe this was real, that someone was finally listening, that the nightmare might actually be ending. Rhett turned back to him and signed again, slow and deliberate so there was no mistaking the meaning. "You're safe now. No one touches you, no one takes you, never again." Soren's hands trembled as he signed back. "I was scared you wouldn't believe me." "I've been looking for you for 3 years, Rhett signed. "I never stopped, I never gave up, and I never will." That's when Soren's voice emerged, rough, damaged from years of disuse, barely more than a whisper, but real and present and breaking the silence he'd been forced into. "Rhett." The entire ballroom went silent, not because of what he said, because of what it meant. The mute Omega everyone had dismissed, everyone had mocked, everyone had assumed was too broken to matter, he'd just spoken, and his first word was a name that carried 3 years of survival in its syllables. Dahlia made one last desperate move. She grabbed for the folder, her face twisted in rage and panic. "You can't prove any." Soren pulled out the final document before she could reach it, a transcript, printed on official letterhead from a recording that had been properly logged and time-stamped, and at the top, in bold text, "Audio evidence Dahlia Crestwick." The words beneath were simple, clear, damning. "If he speaks, cut his throat. If he resists, drug him. Rhett will marry me either way." Dated 3 years ago, recorded in a Crestwick Foundation medical office, with metadata that proved it hadn't been tampered with. Dahlia's face drained of all color. She looked at Rhett, at Soren, at the guests now filming everything on their phones, at her mother who'd gone rigid with horror because they both understood what this meant. It meant the empire was over, the protection was gone. The carefully constructed lies had just collapsed under the weight of one pregnant Omega who'd survived hell and walked back into it willingly because justice mattered more than safety. Rhett took the transcript from Soren's hands, read it once, twice, then looked at Dahlia with an expression that made several people in the room step back. "The jokes end now," he said quietly. And suddenly, everyone realized the real show hadn't started yet. What will Rhett do next, and will Soren survive the fallout of exposing an empire? The transcript hit the floor and Dahlia's world shattered with it. She grabbed for it, hands clawing air, heels sliding on marble, but Rhett was faster. He snatched the paper before her manicured fingers could reach, held it high enough that the ballroom's cameras caught every word printed in black ink. Official timestamp, court-admissible metadata, her voice transcribed into evidence that couldn't be deleted or denied. If he speaks, cut his throat. If he resists, drug him. Rhett will marry me either way. Someone in the crowd screamed, not dramatic, real, the kind of sound people make when they realize they've been standing next to a monster. Dahlia's mother moved first, years of crisis management kicking in despite the horror spreading across her face. She grabbed her daughter's arm, tried pulling her toward the service exit. "We're leaving, now, don't say another word." But Rhett's soldiers had already moved. Silent, professional, they didn't draw weapons, didn't need to, just positioned themselves at every door, every window, every possible escape route. The message was clear: nobody leaves until this ends. Soren swayed on his feet, his hand pressed hard against his belly like he was trying to hold himself together through sheer will. The baby kicked visibly, strong enough that people nearby flinched. 8 months pregnant, standing in front of the people who'd tried to erase him, and somehow still standing. Rhett caught him before he fell, one arm around Soren's shoulders, careful not to press against his stomach, just steady support that said, "I've got you." Soren's weight sagged against him, exhausted, overwhelmed, finally letting someone else carry the burden he'd been holding alone for 3 years. "Everyone stay exactly where you are." Rhett's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "This room is now a crime scene. Anyone who tries to leave gets charged as an accessory." He looked directly at the old guard men reaching for their phones. "That includes you, hands visible, now." They complied, not out of respect, out of survival instinct, because Rhett Marcelli's reputation wasn't built on mercy, it was built on precision, and everyone in that room understood they were watching precision in action. Soren pulled another document from his folder with shaking fingers. This one was thicker, stapled, official-looking in that way government paperwork always looked, boring until you read the contents. He held it up toward the crowd, let them see the header. Federal Investigation Warrant, CISTWSEK Medical Foundation. Dated today. Signed by a federal judge that morning. Pre-approved and waiting for probable cause. Dahlia's face went from white to grey. Her mother actually stumbled, champagne glass slipping from her hand to explode against the floor, because they both understood what this meant. Rhett hadn't been bluffing, he'd been preparing, building. Waiting for exactly this moment. "You've been investigating us," Dahlia's voice came out strangled. "For how long?" 3 years, Rhett said simply. "Since the night Soren disappeared and I found a dock worker who remembered a Crestwick Foundation van at the pier." He gestured to the warrant. "I've had federal agents embedded in your shipping company, your medical board, your charity foundations, every transaction, every suspicious patient transfer, every Omega who checked into your rehabilitation facility and never checked out." His smile was ice. "Did you really think I'd just accept that he left me?" Soren handed Rhett another document, then another, hospital records showing forced sedation, shipping manifests with weight discrepancies that matched human cargo, photographs of the concrete room where they'd kept him, medical equipment, restraints, a narrow window that showed the Chicago skyline in the distance, so close but impossible to reach. And names, so many names, doctors who'd falsified records, security guards who'd moved prisoners, politicians who'd blocked investigations, all connected through money trails that led back to Crestwick accounts hidden behind shell corporations and charity foundations. The room erupted again, louder this time. Guests shouting at each other, at the Crestwicks, at anyone who'd look at them. Some tried to distance themselves, claiming ignorance. Others went silent, calculating their own exposure. The old guard men started moving toward Dahlia's family with expressions that promised violence because their own businesses were tied to Crestwick operations, and if that empire fell, it would take them down too. Rhett raised one hand and the room froze, not because he shouted, because his soldiers shifted their positions just enough to remind everyone who controlled this space, who controlled this city, who held the power to decide what happened next. "Here's how this works," Rhett said, his voice calm and absolute. "Federal agents are already surrounding this building. They'll be here in 3 minutes. Anyone involved in trafficking, in falsifying records, in covering up disappearances, you leave in handcuffs. Anyone who knew and stayed silent, you leave with nothing. Your accounts frozen, your businesses investigated, your reputations destroyed." Dahlia lunged at Soren, her face twisted with rage that finally showed the truth beneath her perfect exterior. "You ruined everything. You were supposed to stay gone. You were supposed to." Rhett caught her wrist mid-reach. Didn't hurt her, just stopped her completely. His grip was iron wrapped in silk, gentle enough not to bruise, strong enough that she couldn't move. "Touch him," Rhett said quietly, "and what happens to you won't be legal." Dahlia yanked her hand back, breathing hard, mascara starting to run. "You can't do this. My family has protected this city for generations. We have connections at every level. We had connections," Rhett corrected, past tense, because every single one of them is about to choose between their freedom and your family. He glanced at the crowd. "Anyone here want to go down with the Crestwicks?" "No, I didn't think so." Sirens started wailing in the distance. Not just one or two, a fleet. The sound that meant federal agents, not local cops who could be bought. The guests who'd been recording on their phones suddenly looked terrified, realizing their footage would be evidence, their presence would be questioned, their own connections to the Crestwicks would be investigated. Soren's voice emerged again, stronger this time despite how much speaking clearly hurt. "There are others." He had to pause between words, catching his breath. "Still trapped, in the facilities. 23 Omegas, I have their names." The room went dead silent. 23. Not one disappeared Omega who'd miraculously escaped. 23 currently imprisoned people whose families thought they were in rehabilitation or lost or dead. 23 pieces of evidence that would turn this from a scandal into a federal case that would dominate headlines for years. Rhett looked at Dahlia with an expression that finally showed the rage he'd been controlling. "You didn't just take Soren, you built an industry. You trafficked people for 3 years while I searched for one, and the whole time you were adding more." His voice dropped lower, dangerous. "You invited him here to mock him, to break him publicly, to prove you'd won." He stepped closer to Dahlia, close enough that she could smell the alpha fury coming off him in waves. "Congratulations, you got your stage." The federal agents burst through the doors right on cue, tactical gear, badges, weapons drawn. They moved with efficiency that said they'd been planning this raid for months, because they had been. Rhett had made sure of it, every piece of evidence verified, every legal angle covered, every possible defense already dismantled before the first arrest warrant was written. Dahlia Crestwick, the lead agent, announced, pulling out handcuffs. "You're under arrest for human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit." Dahlia screamed, not words, just rage and terror, and the sound of someone who'd spent her entire life believing she was untouchable finally realizing she'd been wrong. Her mother tried to run, made it 5 steps before 2 agents tackled her. Her father had the sense to put his hands up, already calling for his lawyer in a voice that shook. And through it all, Soren stood there with Rhett's arm around him, watching the empire that had tried to destroy him collapse in real time. But just as the first handcuffs clicked shut, Soren's knees buckled and his hand flew to his stomach with a gasp that cut through every other sound in that ballroom. Will Soren survive the stress of finally speaking his truth, or has exposing his captors cost him everything? Blood hit the marble floor before anyone could react. Not much, just enough to paint a dark stain on champagne-colored stone and make every alpha in that room lose their minds. Soren's face went paperwhite, his hands clutching his belly as he doubled over with a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like air being forced out of lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. Rhett caught him before he hit the ground, scooped him up like he weighed nothing despite the pregnancy, despite the chaos, despite federal agents still reading rights and guests still panicking. Medic, now. The ballroom transformed again, agents clearing space, Rhett's soldiers forming a protective barrier. Someone overturned a table to make room. The crystal chandelier overhead caught the scene in fractured light, beauty and violence and desperation all mixed together. Soren's eyes rolled back. His breathing came in short gasps that meant pain was overwhelming everything else. The baby was moving frantically, visible shifts under his coat that looked wrong, too too aggressive, like something inside was trying to escape. "Don't you dare," Rhett whispered against Soren's hair, his voice cracking for the first time that night. "Not now, not after everything. Stay with me." A federal medic pushed through the crowd, tactical gear, medical bag, the kind of efficiency that came from treating gunshot wounds in active combat. She took one look at Soren and her face went grim. "He's in premature labor, stress-induced. We need to transport now." "Then transport," Rhett snapped. "So with all respect, moving him could." "I don't care what it could do. Staying here definitely will." Rhett looked at the chaos around them, Dahlia screaming obscenities while being dragged out, her family shouting for lawyers, guests filming everything on phones that would upload to social media within minutes. "Get him out of here. Use my private ambulance. Full escort. No stops." The medic nodded and signaled her team. They moved fast, stretcher appearing out of nowhere. IV lines started before Soren even understood what was happening, oxygen mask fitted over his face. Rhett stayed close the entire time, one hand wrapped around Soren's like he could transfer strength through sheer will. Dahlia saw them preparing to leave and lost whatever composure she had left. She twisted against the agents holding her, her face contorted with rage. "This is your fault. You did this. You came here pregnant and weak and—" Rhett turned on her with an expression that made the agents holding her step back. He didn't yell, didn't need to. His voice came out cold and final, the tone he used right before someone disappeared from the city permanently. "You trafficked Omegas, you drugged them, you locked them in concrete rooms and sold them like cargo." He took one step toward her, just one, but it was enough to make her shrink back. "You did this to yourself, and when you're sitting in a federal prison cell for the next 30 years, I want you to remember something." He leaned in close enough that only she could hear. "He survived you. And that will always be the proof that you were never as powerful as you thought." Dahlia's face crumpled, not with remorse, with the realization that she'd lost everything, reputation, freedom, future, because she'd underestimated the quiet strength of someone she'd dismissed as weak. The medics started moving Soren toward the exit. Rhett followed without looking back. His soldiers fell into formation around them automatically, a mobile fortress that cleared the path through federal agents and panicking guests and photographers trying to get one last shot. Behind them, the arrests continued. Crestwick family members, medical board directors, security personnel who'd moved prisoners, shipping company executives who'd falsified manifests. The list kept growing as federal agents worked through the evidence Soren had provided, names, dates, locations, everything documented with the kind of precision that came from someone who'd been planning this escape for years. By the time they reached the ambulance, Soren had lost consciousness. His breathing was shallow but steady. The baby had stopped moving frantically, either settling or something worse. The medic wouldn't meet Rhett's eyes when he asked, which told him everything he needed to know. This could go either way. "Drive fast," Rhett ordered the ambulance driver. "Run every red light. I'll handle the cops." They loaded Soren into the back and Rhett climbed in after him, refusing to let go of his hand even as the medic tried to work around him. The doors slammed shut and the ambulance took off with sirens wailing, cutting through Chicago traffic like Judgment Day had wheels. Inside, Rhett finally let himself look at Soren, really look, the exhaustion carved into his face, the bruises on his wrists that had faded but were still visible if you knew where to look, the way his body had memorized fear so deeply that even unconscious he curled in on himself, protective of the baby even when he couldn't protect himself. 3 years of this. 3 years of waking up in that concrete room, being drugged, being told he'd never leave, being forced to carry a child in captivity while the world forgot he existed. And he'd survived. Not just survived, documented everything, every face, every conversation, every shipping manifest he'd glimpsed when guards weren't watching. He'd turned himself into a witness so thorough that his testimony alone could bury an entire empire. That kind of strength didn't come from weakness. It came from love powerful enough to endure hell, because the other side mattered more than survival. The hospital came into view, private wing, pre-cleared by Rhett's security team, doctors already waiting. They'd been on standby for weeks because Rhett had known somehow that Soren was still out there, that he'd come back, that when he did, he'd need protection Rhett had spent 3 years preparing to provide. They rushed Soren inside, and Rhett had to let go of his hand for the first time since the ballroom. Had to watch them wheel him through doors marked authorized personnel only. Had to stand in a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and fear, while strangers disappeared with the only person who'd ever made Rhett want to be better. His phone buzzed, multiple calls from his captains, from federal agents, from lawyers who'd been waiting years for this case to break open. He ignored them all except one, a text from the agent in charge of the raid. All targets in custody, 23 Omegas located and extracted from facilities. Evidence secured. Press is going insane. You need to make a statement. Rhett typed back one word, later. Because statements could wait. Legal proceedings could wait. The entire city burning itself down over this scandal could wait. Right now, all that mattered was the sound of a heartbeat monitor somewhere behind those doors, and the prayer Rhett hadn't said since he was a child, the kind that admitted he wasn't in control, that some things were bigger than power or money or revenge. An hour passed, then two. Doctors came and went with expressions that gave nothing away. Nurses whispered to each other in medical code that Rhett understood just enough to know meant complicated and unstable and waiting. Finally, a doctor emerged, older woman, exhausted eyes, the kind of face that had delivered both miracles and tragedies. She looked at Rhett and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, maybe, or just understanding that the man standing in front of her would burn the hospital down if she delivered the wrong news. He's stable, she said first, because she was smart enough to lead with the outcome that wouldn't trigger violence. The labor stopped. We've given him medication to prevent contractions and... The baby, Rhett interrupted. Strong heartbeat, good movement, no signs of distress. Rhett's knees almost buckled. He caught himself against the wall, breathing hard, feeling 3 years of tension finally start to release because they were alive. Both of them, against every odd, despite everything, somehow still here. But, the doctor continued, her voice careful, he's been through severe trauma, physical and psychological. His body is trying to protect the baby, but it's also trying to shut down from stress. We need to keep him here for observation. Minimum 2 weeks, maybe longer. Do it, Rhett said immediately. Whatever he needs. Money isn't an issue, just keep them safe. The doctor nodded. You can see him now, but he's sedated. He probably won't wake up for several hours. Rhett followed her through the doors into a private room that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. Soft lighting, comfortable furniture, windows that showed the Chicago skyline, but were bulletproof because Rhett had specified that when he'd arranged this weeks ago. Soren lay in the center bed looking impossibly small against white sheets. IV lines ran from his arms. Monitors tracked his heartbeat, the baby's heartbeat, his breathing, his vitals. But his face looked peaceful for the first time since Rhett had seen him in that ballroom. No fear, no pain, just rest. Rhett pulled a chair next to the bed and took Soren's hand again. Signed against his palm even though Soren couldn't see. I'm here, I'm not leaving, you're safe. His phone buzzed again. Another text from his captain. News is everywhere. Crestwick Empire collapsed. Stock prices crashing. Politicians distancing themselves. You're being called a hero. Rhett looked at Soren sleeping, peacefully despite everything the world had tried to do to him, and thought about what real heroism looked like. It wasn't power. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was survival against impossible odds, and then walking back into hell willingly, because truth mattered more than safety. He typed back, Soren's the hero, make sure everyone knows that. And then he turned off his phone, laced his fingers through Soren's, and waited for the moment those eyes would open and finally, see a world where they didn't have to be afraid anymore. Will Soren and the baby survive the aftermath, or has the cost of justice been too high? The truth came out in pieces over the next 48 hours, each revelation worse than the last. 23 Omegas extracted from Crestwick facilities across 3 states. Some had been there for months, others for years. All of them drugged, documented, prepared for shipping to international buyers who paid premium prices for American-born Omegas who couldn't fight back or speak up or be traced. The youngest was 19, the oldest was 46. None of them had families actively searching because the Crestwicks had been smart. They'd targeted people who wouldn't be missed. Foster care runaways, undocumented immigrants, Omegas whose families had already given up on them or been paid off to look the other way. Federal agents found shipping records that made seasoned investigators vomit. Manifests listing human cargo as medical equipment. Invoices charging $200,000 per Omega to buyers in Dubai, Moscow, Hong Kong. Email chains between Dahlia's father and overseas contacts discussing product quality and delivery schedules like they were trading furniture instead of lives. The medical records were somehow worse. Forced sedation protocols. Experimental drugs tested on captive subjects without consent. Notes from doctors describing how long they could keep an Omega drugged before permanent brain damage occurred, not out of concern for the victims, but to preserve merchandise value. And at the center of everything, the architect, the recruiter, The person who'd transformed her family's legitimate medical foundation into a trafficking pipeline was Dahlia Crestwick. She'd started small 5 years ago, identified vulnerable Omegas through charity work, befriended them, offered help. Then made them disappear through a medical system her family controlled from board level down to which doctors got hired and which questions went unasked. She'd been 19 when she trafficked her first Omega, 24 when she met Rhett and decided he was a better investment than continuing the family business. But she couldn't let it go completely. The money was too good, the power too addictive, so she delegated, put others in charge, told herself she wasn't really involved anymore even while signing off on shipping manifests and approving new facility locations. Then Rhett fell in love with Soren and Dahlia saw her careful plans collapsing, saw an alpha boss who was supposed to prioritize power choosing a mute janitor instead, saw her future as queen of Chicago's underworld slipping away because love turned out to be stronger than strategy. So she'd used the family business one last time, made Soren disappear, made it look clean, professional, impossible to trace, and genuinely believed that erasing the competition would make Rhett forget and fall in line. She'd never considered that Rhett would search, that he'd investigate, that he'd spend 3 years building a case so airtight it would destroy everyone involved. And she definitely never imagined Soren would escape. The details of that escape came out slowly as Soren recovered. He'd been held in a facility outside the city, close enough to Chicago that Rhett had probably driven past it 100 times while searching, far enough that no one thought to look there. The building was listed as a medical research center, had all the right permits, attracted no suspicion because the Crestwicks had spent years making sure it looked legitimate. Soren had been kept in a basement level that didn't appear on official blueprints. Concrete walls, reinforced door, one window too small to escape through, but large enough to see the skyline and know exactly how close freedom was while being completely unreachable. They drugged him the first year, kept him sedated most days, barely conscious, existing in that fog between awareness and oblivion where time stopped meaning anything. He'd been pregnant within 3 months, artificial insemination, because they'd wanted to see if Omega captives could successfully carry to term while drugged. If yes, that opened another revenue stream selling pregnant Omegas at premium prices. But Soren's body had reacted badly to the drugs. He'd started losing weight, showing signs of organ stress, becoming less valuable merchandise. So they'd reduced his dosage, trying to find the balance between compliant and healthy. That's when Soren started planning. He pretended the drugs still worked, acted sedated even when his mind was clearing, memorized guard schedules, camera positions, which doors stayed unlocked during shift changes. He'd started keeping notes, tiny scraps of paper hidden in his mattress, under floor tiles, anywhere the guards wouldn't think to look. When they'd moved him to a different facility after 18 months, he'd stolen documents during the transfer, shipping manifests left on a desk, patient files someone forgot to lock away, a guard's phone that had photos of the concrete rooms time-stamped and geotagged. He'd compiled evidence for 2 years while pregnant and imprisoned, knowing that escape without proof was pointless. That Rhett might be able to hide him but couldn't destroy the Crestwicks without ammunition. That the only way to guarantee safety for himself, their child, and every other Omega in that system was to make sure the truth couldn't be buried. The actual escape happened 3 weeks ago. A new guard who didn't follow protocols. A door left unlocked during a medical transfer. Soren had walked out wearing scrubs he'd stolen, carrying a folder he'd been assembling for 2 years, 8 months pregnant and terrified but determined. He'd made it to a bus station before his body gave out, collapsed in a public bathroom. A kind stranger, an older alpha woman who'd lost her own child to trafficking, had found him, given him money, helped him get to Chicago without asking questions that could make her an accessory. And Soren had gone directly to that gala, because he'd been tracking Rhett's movements through newspapers and society pages, knew the engagement party would be public and filmed, knew that Dahlia's attempt to humiliate him would be the perfect stage to expose everything. He'd walked into that ballroom knowing he might die there, knowing the stress could trigger labor, knowing the Crestwicks had security and money and power enough to make him disappear again. But he'd also known that Rhett was good, that underneath the Mafia boss reputation was a man who'd spent 3 years searching because love didn't expire when someone vanished, that if anyone would believe his evidence and use it to burn an empire down, it would be the alpha who'd learned sign language in 3 weeks just to have conversations at 3 in the morning. Now lying in a hospital bed with monitors tracking his vitals and Rhett's soldiers guarding every entrance, Soren finally understood what safety felt like. It felt like Rhett holding his hand through sedative-induced sleep, like doctors who actually cared if he lived, like a room with windows he could see out of, and doors that stayed unlocked because prison wasn't protection. The media called it the scandal of the decade. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the Crestwicks. Celebrities who'd attended their charity galas issued public apologies. Stock prices for every company associated with the family crashed so hard the SEC got involved. Dahlia's mother cut a deal, testimony against her husband and daughter in exchange for a lighter sentence. Her father refused to talk, hired the most expensive lawyers money could buy, and lost anyway because the evidence was overwhelming. And Dahlia herself sat in a federal holding cell, watching her entire world collapse on news channels that played footage of that ballroom confrontation on repeat, watching Soren hold up documents, watching Rhett defend him, watching her own face drain of color as she realized her perfect plan had been perfect revenge against herself. Her lawyer suggested a plea deal. She refused, claimed innocence, said she'd been framed, insisted this was all a conspiracy by Rhett to take over her family's business. The jury took 90 minutes to convict her on all counts. 35 years minimum, federal prison, no parole possibility for at least 25. Her face when they read the verdict would become a meme within hours, that moment of absolute horror when someone who'd spent their whole life believing they were untouchable finally understood they'd been wrong. But Rhett didn't watch the trial, didn't attend the sentencing, didn't give interviews or make statements or do anything except stay in that hospital room and wait for Soren to wake up fully, to speak again, to realize that the nightmare was actually over. It took 5 days. 5 days of sedation gradually wearing off, of Soren's eyes opening briefly then closing again, too exhausted to stay conscious, of doctors adjusting medication, monitoring the baby, making sure both patients stabilized before allowing full awareness. When Soren finally woke up completely, Rhett was signing before words could form. "You're safe, the Crestwicks are in prison. All 23 Omegas were rescued. You did it." Soren's eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion he'd let himself feel since escape. His hands moved slowly, rusty but determined. "The baby. Strong, healthy, due in 4 weeks if you make it that long." Soren's laugh came out broken and beautiful. Relief, joy, disbelief that they'd survived when every odd said they shouldn't have. Then his expression changed, became serious. Worried, his hands moved again. "What did it cost you, your reputation, your empire?" Rhett smiled, genuine warmth that made him look like the man Soren had first fallen in love with years ago in a hospital cafeteria. He signed back carefully, making sure every gesture was clear. "Nothing that mattered, and I gained everything I almost lost." That's when Soren spoke again, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you, that I had to just disappear and make you think." Rhett kissed his forehead, not romantic, just tender, the kind of affection that said you're forgiven for things that were never your fault. "You survived," Rhett said simply. "That's all that matters, everything else is just details." Outside the hospital room, Chicago continued rebuilding around the crater where the Crestwick Empire used to stand. Inside, 2 people who'd spent 3 years being torn apart finally had the one thing they'd been denied all along. Time. Can Rhett and Soren truly heal from 3 years of trauma, or will the scars run too deep? Dahlia's sentencing aired live across every news channel, and Rhett made sure Soren didn't see it. Some moments didn't need witnessing, some endings didn't need attendance. Justice served was enough. You didn't need to watch your abuser break down crying in orange prison clothing to know they'd finally faced consequences. So Rhett kept the hospital room TV off, kept newspapers away, made sure Soren's focus stayed on healing instead of revenge. But the rest of Chicago watched Dahlia walk into that courtroom in chains, her perfect composure finally shattered. Watched prosecutors present evidence so damning even her expensive lawyers couldn't spin it. Watched victims testify, Omegas who'd survived her trafficking pipeline, families who'd lost children to her system, medical professionals who'd been threatened into silence for years. The judge didn't show mercy. Why would she? 35 years federal prison, asset forfeiture, restitution payments that would bankrupt what little the family had left, and a statement read aloud for the public record that made clear this wasn't just about one woman's crimes, it was about dismantling an entire system that had protected traffickers for decades. Dahlia had tried to speak at her sentencing, tried to claim she'd been manipulated, that her father had controlled everything, that she'd been just as much a victim as those Omegas who'd suffered. The judge cut her off. "You recruited vulnerable people, you profited from their pain, you celebrated their captivity while wearing designer clothing purchased with money earned from their suffering. Save your excuses for your therapist. This court recognizes only facts. The gavel came down and Dahlia's life as she'd known it ended. No appeals would save her. No connections could reach her anymore. Just decades of concrete walls and prison uniforms, and the knowledge that she'd destroyed herself trying to destroy someone else. Her mother got 15 years for conspiracy and aiding trafficking operations. Her father got life without parole for running the enterprise. Security personnel, medical staff, shipping company executives, they all fell like dominoes once the foundation cracked, each one trying to save themselves by testifying against others. The Crestwick Foundation dissolved, their assets liquidated. The money went to victim restitution funds and anti-trafficking organizations. Their name became synonymous with evil the way certain families' names do when history remembers them only for the worst things they did. But inside Soren's hospital room, none of that mattered as much as the baby moving inside him and Rhett reading, aloud from a book of names they'd picked together. Luca, Rhett suggested, his finger tracing down the page, means bringer of light. Soren signed his approval, then added, because we needed light after so much darkness. They'd been doing this for days, planning for a future that felt impossible until recently, talking about nursery colors and parenting books and all the normal concerns people had when bringing a child into the world. Not trauma, not revenge, just hope cautiously rebuilding itself after 3 years of being demolished. The doctor approved Soren's discharge after 2 weeks. His vitals had stabilized, the baby's heartbeat stayed strong, the premature labor threat had passed completely, but she warned them both that the pregnancy was still high risk, that stress could trigger complications, that Soren needed absolute rest until delivery. Rhett moved him into a private penthouse, different location from his usual residence, off the books, secured by his most trusted people, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Modern kitchen Soren would never have to use because Rhett hired a private chef. Nursery already set up with everything recommended by 3 different parenting experts Rhett had consulted. It felt surreal, Soren walking through a home meant for him, after years of concrete cells and restraints and windows too small to escape through. Sometimes he'd just stand in the middle of a room and cry, not from sadness but from relief so overwhelming it had nowhere else to go. Rhett gave him space to process, never pushed, just stayed close enough that Soren knew he wasn't alone while being far enough away that safety didn't feel like surveillance. They talked sometimes, Soren's voice getting stronger each day as his throat remembered how to shape words after years of enforced silence. He told Rhett about the facility, about the guards who'd been cruel and the ones who'd been indifferent, which somehow felt worse, about the other Omegas he'd known briefly before they were shipped away, wondering if they'd survived or if he'd been lucky in ways they hadn't. Rhett listened without interrupting, never tried to fix things that couldn't be fixed, just heard the truth and held the weight of it alongside Soren so he didn't have to carry it alone. Other times they didn't talk at all, just existed together in silence that felt safe instead of oppressive. Rhett would read while Soren sketched, his notepad collection rebuilt from scratch, filled with drawings of Chicago skyline from their windows and baby clothes he wanted to make and faces of people who'd helped him escape. The 23 rescued Omegas went through similar recoveries. Some went home to families who'd never stopped searching. Others had no homes to return to, so Rhett established a foundation, funded by liquidated Crestwick assets, that provided housing, therapy, job training, and legal support. He made sure every single one of them knew they'd been believed, valued, and that their survival mattered. Several of them visited Soren once he was stable enough for guests, shared their own stories, thanked him for being brave enough to carry evidence out even while carrying a child, called him a hero in ways that made Soren uncomfortable because he'd never felt heroic, just desperate and determined and lucky enough to have someone waiting who still loved him after 3 years. The city changed too. New laws passed targeting trafficking pipelines, medical boards reformed, shipping companies faced increased inspections. Politicians who'd looked the other way suddenly couldn't afford to anymore because public outrage demanded accountability. It wasn't perfect, systems that broke and didn't fix overnight, but it was progress. Real, measurable change that meant the 24 people who'd survived weren't just victims, they were catalysts for protecting others who came after. And then, 4 weeks after Soren's discharge, at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday that started like any other, his water broke. Rhett was awake instantly. He'd been sleeping light for weeks, some instinct telling him to stay ready. He called the hospital while helping Soren into prepared clothes, grabbed the bag they'd packed together, and had his driver downstairs within minutes. The contractions started before they reached the hospital. Soren's face went pale, and he gripped Rhett's hand hard enough to hurt, his breathing coming in controlled counts the way the birthing class instructor had taught them. Talk to me, Rhett said, signing with his free hand even though Soren could hear now. Tell me what you need. Soren's voice came out strained but clear. Just, don't leave. Don't let them take me anywhere you can't follow. Never, Rhett promised. I'm not losing you again, not for a second. They made it to the hospital's private wing where doctors were already waiting. Rhett refused to leave during prep, during examinations, during any moment that hospital protocol said family should wait outside. He stayed at Soren's side with hands intertwined and promises whispered in the language they'd built together. Sign and speech and silence that meant I'm here and you're not alone, and we're going to make it through this. Labor lasted 8 hours, long enough that Soren's strength started failing, long enough that doctors looked worried, long enough that Rhett started wondering if surviving everything else only to lose Soren during childbirth was the universe's cruelest joke. But then the baby crowned, then shoulders emerged. Then the doctor said one more push, and Soren gathered strength he shouldn't have had left and brought their child into a world that had tried to prevent this moment from ever happening. The cry that filled the room was the most beautiful sound Rhett had ever heard. Loud, healthy, alive, proof that love could survive captivity and that hope could be born even from trauma. It's a boy, the doctor announced, placing the baby on Soren's chest. Perfect, healthy, 8 pounds exactly. Soren looked down at his son, their son, and started crying. Not quiet tears, real sobbing that came from somewhere deep and broken and finally starting to heal. Rhett wrapped his arms around both of them, his own face wet, his voice cracked when he spoke. Luca, our bringer of light. The baby's eyes opened, dark and curious, and completely unaware that his existence had already changed the world just by happening. Soren kissed his forehead and signed one-handed to Rhett. He's perfect. Just like his father, Rhett signed back. Outside that hospital room, cameras waited for statements. Reporters wanted details. The city wanted to know about the baby born from the scandal that had destroyed an empire. But inside, none of that noise could reach them. Just a family building itself from pieces that had been scattered 3 years ago, proving that some things were stronger than captivity. That love could survive anything. That silence could be broken. That light always returned. After everything they've endured, can Rhett, Soren, and baby Luca finally find the peace they fought so hard to claim? Luca was 6 weeks old when Soren spoke his first full sentence without pain. They were in the penthouse nursery, walls painted soft grey with white trim, constellation decals on the ceiling, a rocking chair by the window where dawn light painted everything gold. Soren held Luca against his chest, the baby sleeping with that absolute trust infants have when the world still feels safe. Rhett stood in the doorway watching them, and Soren turned with a smile that didn't carry weight anymore. Just joy, simple and uncomplicated and real. I think he looks like you, Soren said, his voice clear and steady. Rhett's throat tightened, not from sadness, from relief so profound it felt like prayer, because that sentence meant healing, meant Soren's body had finally stopped treating speech as trauma and started recognizing it as choice. He looks like us, Rhett corrected, moving into the room. Your eyes, my stubborn chin, your kindness, my need to protect everything I love. Soren laughed, soft enough not to wake Luca, warm enough to fill the space between them. That's going to make him impossible as a teenager. Good, impossible kids survive better. They sat together in that rocking chair, too small for 2 adults and an infant, but they made it work, watching Chicago wake up through bulletproof windows that didn't feel like prison because the locks were on their side now. The city had moved on the way cities do. The Crestwick scandal became last month's news, replaced by new controversies and political dramas, but the changes it forced stayed. Laws protecting Omegas, medical oversight committees that actually investigated complaints, a trafficking hotline funded by liquidated Crestwick assets that had already rescued 17 people in 6 weeks. The 23 Omegas who'd been extracted started rebuilding their lives. Some stayed in Chicago near the support network Rhett had established. Others moved away, wanting distance from memories that place could trigger. But they all stayed in touch, text threads and video calls, and occasional meetups where they could be understood without explaining. They called themselves survivors, but Rhett knew better. They were warriors. Every single one of them had fought battles no one should have to fight, and won by simply refusing to stop existing. That kind of strength didn't come with medals or parades. It came with therapy appointments and panic attacks and days where getting out of bed felt impossible, but they did it anyway. Soren had started speaking publicly after Luca's birth. Not interviews, he refused those, but advocacy work, testifying at legislative hearings, training police on how to identify trafficking operations, working with the foundation Rhett had established to create resources for other survivors. His voice was becoming known, not famous, but respected, the kind of authority that came from lived experience rather than studied theory. When Soren said this is what trafficking looks like, or this is how they silence victims, people listened because he'd survived what he was describing. Rhett's empire had changed too. He'd walked away from the grey areas, the territory disputes and protection rackets and under-the-table deals that kept things running but required moral compromises, kept the legitimate businesses, invested in community programs, used his influence to push anti-trafficking legislation that politicians had been ignoring for years. Some of the old guard called it weakness, said he'd gone soft, whispered that falling in love had broken the king of Chicago's edge. Rhett didn't care, let them think what they wanted. He knew the truth. Loving someone didn't make you soft. It made you fierce in ways that violence never could, made you willing to burn down empires and rebuild better ones because the person beside you deserved a world worth living in. He still had power, still controlled enough of the city that people respected his boundaries and feared his consequences. But now that power had purpose beyond accumulation, it protected people who couldn't protect themselves, created space for healing that systems usually denied, proved that you could rule without cruelty if you were willing to work harder than cruelty required. Luca stirred against Soren's chest, making the small sounds Barbies make when transitioning between sleep stages. His tiny hand opened and closed, grasping nothing, but showing the instinct to hold on. In a few years he'd be walking and talking and asking questions about why Daddy couldn't speak for a while, and why Papa seemed sad sometimes when looking at certain buildings. They'd tell him the truth, age-appropriate versions first, then fuller details as he grew old enough to understand, because hiding trauma didn't protect children, it just taught them that pain was shameful. Better to teach him that people survived hard things, that silence could be broken, that love was worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. "What are you thinking?" Soren asked, noticing Rhett's distant expression. Rhett signed his answer before speaking it aloud, keeping the language they'd built together alive, even though Soren could hear now. "That you're the strongest person I've ever met, that our son is going to grow up knowing what real courage looks like, that I'm grateful every single day that you survived." Soren's eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. "I survived because you never stopped looking, because even when I was gone, you were building the case that would free everyone. We did this together. You walked back into hell carrying evidence and our child. That's not together, that's you being extraordinary. You learned sign language in 3 weeks because you wanted to talk to me. That's pretty extraordinary too." They smiled at each other, the kind of expression that held 3 years of pain and 6 weeks of healing and a future stretching out with possibility. Not perfect. Trauma didn't disappear just because justice was served, but manageable, survivable, worthy of effort. Luca woke fully, his dark eyes opening wide, his face scrunching in that way Barbies do before deciding whether to cry or stay calm. Soren rocked gently, humming a melody without words, and Luca settled back into contentment. Rhett watched them both and thought about the night Soren had walked into that ballroom, how everything could have gone wrong, how Soren could have collapsed before delivering evidence, how the Crestwicks could have successfully silenced him one final time, how the baby could have been born too early, too stressed, too damaged by the trauma his carrier had endured. But none of those worst-case scenarios happened. Instead, they'd survived. Soren had spoken, justice had prevailed, and now they were building a life that honored the fight it took to get here without being defined by it. That was the real victory, not the Crestwick convictions or the policy changes or the foundation helping others. Those mattered, but they were external. The real triumph was internal, Soren looking at their son without fear, Rhett sleeping through the night because he wasn't searching anymore, a family existing without threat because the people who'd tried to destroy them had been destroyed instead. "I have something for you," Rhett said suddenly, pulling a small box from his pocket. Soren looked confused. "You've already given me everything. The penthouse, the security, the foundation." "Those aren't gifts, those are bare minimum for what you deserved all along." Rhett opened the box to reveal a simple ring, silver band, no stones, just elegant metal that caught the light. "I bought this 3 years ago. Was going to propose the week you disappeared. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment." Soren's breath caught. "Rhett, I'm not asking you to marry me today. I'm not asking you to make decisions while you're still healing. I just want you to know that from the second I met you, I knew you were the person I wanted to build a life with. 3 years of searching didn't change that. Nothing ever will." He took Soren's hand, the one not holding Luca, and slipped the ring on carefully. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting 3 years to come home. Soren looked at the ring, then at Rhett, then at their sleeping son. When he spoke, his voice carried no doubt. Yes. I haven't asked the question yet. You did 3 years ago when you learned sign language because you wanted to understand me, when you searched for me even when everyone said to give up, when you stayed beside me in that hospital and promised I was safe. Soren smiled. The answer was always yes. The ring was just waiting for the right time. Rhett kissed him then, gentle, reverent, full of promise that they had time now. Time to heal, to build, to become the family they'd both been fighting toward. No more separation, no more silence, no more fear that tomorrow would tear them apart. Just 3 people in a nursery watching dawn paint Chicago gold, proving that the strongest thing anyone can do isn't violence or power or revenge. It's choosing to love someone when the world tries to make that impossible. It's surviving hell because someone on the other side is worth reaching. It's being the kind of person who walks back into danger willingly because truth matters more than safety. Rhett had become king of Chicago through strength and strategy. But Soren had become his salvation through quiet courage that didn't need recognition to be real. And together they'd proven something the Crestwicks never understood. You can't destroy what refuses to break. You can't silence what chooses to speak. You can't erase what leaves evidence. Love like that doesn't disappear. It just waits until it's safe to return. And when it does, it changes everything. Thank you for watching this journey from darkness to light, from silence to voice, from captivity to freedom. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the powerful stories we share. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your words might inspire someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that justice can prevail, and that love is worth fighting for. Let's build a community of survivors, supporters, and believers in second chances together. Your story matters, your voice matters, and somewhere someone needs to hear that they're not alone.